This is True Crime Stories for Sleep. In the first decade of the 20th century, Brooklyn was a place of constant noise, ambition, and survival. The borough teemed with immigrants from Italy, Ireland, Eastern Europe, and beyond, all seeking the American dream but finding instead overcrowded tenements, long hours of grueling work, and meager pay. Out of this landscape of poverty and resilience came Alphonse Gabriel Capone, Charles, Lucky, Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and of course Benjamin Siegel, a boy who would one day be better known as Bugsy, a man whose charm, vision, and violence would leave an indelible mark on organized crime. Born February 28, 1906, to Jewish immigrants Max and Jenny Siegel, Benjamin grew up in Williamsburg, one of the toughest neighborhoods in New York. His parents, who had fled Europe in search of a better life, earned little, his father working as a laborer, his mother taking in piecework to help feed their children. From the start, Benjamin was surrounded by hardship, but hardship alone does not explain what he became. Before we go further into the extraordinary rise of Bugsy Siegel, make sure to subscribe, like this episode, and drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and which true crime figure you'd like me to cover next. Your support helps this series grow and ensures you won't miss more true crime stories. From an early age, Benjamin showed little interest in school. He preferred the streets, where gangs controlled corners and boys his age quickly learned to fight for what they wanted. Teachers described him as disruptive and unfocused, and by his early teens, he had stopped attending regularly. For Benjamin, the lessons of survival were not to be found in books, but in the neighborhood itself. Poverty pressed on everyone, but Benjamin had no intention of staying poor. The streets offered money, power, and above all, respect, things school could never provide. Like many young boys in Williamsburg, Siegel began with small-time schemes. He intimidated pushcart vendors, demanding payment for protection, and threatening to set their stands ablaze if they refused. This crude extortion racket was primitive but effective, and it revealed something about him that would stay constant throughout his life: his readiness to use violence without hesitation. Neighbors began to notice him, and words spread about the hot-tempered kid with piercing eyes who seemed willing to go further than others. That willingness would make him dangerous, but also valuable in a city where muscle often meant survival. It was during these early years that Siegel met the boy who would become his lifelong partner and closest friend, Meyer Lansky. Where Siegel was volatile, Lansky was calculating. Where Siegel relied on raw force, Lansky relied on strategy. Together, they complemented one another perfectly. Lansky admired Siegel's fearlessness, while Siegel trusted Lansky's intelligence. Their partnership was rooted not just in friendship but in ambition. They both wanted more than the scraps life in Brooklyn had given their families. By their teenage years, Siegel and Lansky were already making a name for themselves. They formed a crew of toughs who specialized in extortion and robbery. Unlike other gangs, however, they operated with an unusual mix of discipline and savagery. Siegel became the gang's enforcer, the one who carried the gun and did not flinch when violence was required. His reputation earned him the nickname Bugsy, short for Bugs, slang for someone crazy or unpredictable. Siegel despised the name, preferring to be called Ben, but others felt it fit perfectly. He was charming and magnetic, yet capable of explosive outbursts of violence that left people both fascinated and terrified. The 1920s were a time of seismic change in America. Prohibition, enacted in 1920, created enormous opportunities for those bold enough to defy the law. Bootlegging, smuggling, and speakeasies became the lifeblood of the underworld, and Siegel and Lansky were quick to seize the moment. Their Bugs and Meyer mob became a feared and respected outfit in New York, known for running liquor, hijacking trucks, and eliminating competition with ruthless efficiency. They were not the biggest gang, but their reputation for discipline and violence made them valuable allies and formidable enemies. Through their activities, Siegel and Lansky came into contact with some of the most influential figures in organized crime. Arnold Rothstein, the legendary gambler and fixer often called the father of modern organized crime, became a mentor to Lansky and Siegel. Rothstein believed crime should be run like a business, with organization, efficiency, and a focus on profits over petty vendettas. From him, they learned the importance of thinking beyond the street corner, of creating networks, and of treating crime not just as survival but as enterprise. Rothstein's influence on Siegel was profound, shaping his vision for the future. At the same time, Siegel's charisma set him apart. He was not just another thug. He dressed well, spoke with confidence, and carried himself with an air that suggested he belonged in better circles than the Brooklyn tenements. Women were drawn to him, and men either feared or admired him. Even in his teenage years, he displayed a knack for moving between worlds, blending the roughness of the streets with the charm of someone destined for bigger things. This duality, danger and glamour, would follow him for the rest of his life. Despite his growing reputation, Siegel remained unpredictable. Stories from the time describe him pulling a gun over minor disputes or erupting in sudden fits of rage. Yet this volatility, paradoxically, enhanced his legend. To many, Bugsy was someone you didn't cross, someone whose temper made him capable of anything. To his friends, though, especially Lansky, he was loyal, dependable, and above all, useful. The combination of brains and brutality in their partnership made them a force to be reckoned with. As the decade progressed, Siegel's ambitions grew. He and Lansky were no longer content with small-time rackets. They expanded their operations, hijacking liquor shipments, running gambling dens, and inserting themselves into the growing networks of organized crime. Their reputation caught the attention of other rising figures, including Charles, Lucky, Luciano. Luciano, like Rothstein, envisioned a new order for organized crime, one where ethnic rivalries were set aside in favor of cooperation and profits. He saw in Lansky and Siegel the kind of talent he needed, Lansky for his intelligence, Siegel for his muscle. By the mid-1920s, Siegel's role as an enforcer extended beyond his own crew. He became associated with Murder Incorporated, the enforcement arm of the mob, responsible for carrying out hits across the city. This reputation as a killer only added to his aura of danger. But Siegel was not just feared, he was also admired. His charm, combined with his willingness to do the mob's dirty work, gave him influence far beyond his years. Even as he built his reputation in the underworld, Siegel never lost his taste for glamour. He frequented nightclubs, mingled with entertainers, and developed a style that set him apart from other gangsters. He wanted more than money. He wanted recognition, power, and a lifestyle that reflected his ambitions. Brooklyn might have been his beginning, but Siegel was already looking beyond it, toward bigger opportunities and greater stages. By the end of the 1920s, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel was no longer just a kid from Williamsburg. He had become a central figure in the world of organized crime, his partnership with Lansky firmly established, his reputation as a ruthless enforcer solidified, and his charisma opening doors others could not walk through. He was young, dangerous, and ambitious, a combination that made him both invaluable to the rising powers of the mob and a figure destined for larger-than-life exploits. The boy from Brooklyn had already transformed into the man who would one day change the American underworld forever. By the late 1920s, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel had risen from a scrappy Brooklyn street tough to a figure whose name carried both fear and admiration in the New York underworld. Alongside his inseparable partner Meyer Lansky, he had formed the nucleus of the Bugs and Meyer mob, a crew notorious for discipline, cunning, and an almost theatrical brand of violence. They were not the largest gang in the city, nor the richest, but their reputation spread quickly, fueled by tales of Siegel's quick temper and ruthless efficiency. Where others hesitated, Siegel acted, and his willingness to use bullets to settle disputes made him indispensable to the growing empire of organized crime. The Prohibition era had transformed the landscape of crime in America. With the Volstead Act making alcohol illegal, millions of ordinary Americans still craved liquor, creating a black market worth billions. Bootleggers, smugglers, and gangsters rushed to fill the demand, and New York became one of the most lucrative centers of the trade. For Siegel and Lansky, this was a golden opportunity. Their small crews specialized in hijacking liquor shipments, raiding competitors, and offering protection to those who wanted to keep their operations safe from violence. Each raid made them richer, but just as importantly, it made them more feared. Competitors quickly learned that crossing Siegel often meant a sudden and violent end. Siegel's reputation as an enforcer was well earned. Stories spread of him casually pulling out a pistol in crowded places to intimidate rivals or firing without hesitation when challenged. His fearlessness earned him respect among hardened criminals and solidified the moniker Bugsy, a nickname he despised but could never escape. To those who worked with him, his unpredictability was both an asset and a liability. Friends knew him as fiercely loyal, but enemies learned to fear his explosive rages. The relationship between Siegel and Lansky deepened during these years. Lansky, ever the strategist, saw beyond the immediate profits of hijackings and small-time rackets. He dreamed of building a criminal network run like a corporation, one that could withstand police crackdowns and outlast rival gangs. Siegel provided the muscle to make those dreams possible. Together, they laid the foundation for what would later become the National Crime Syndicate, the organized body that transformed American crime into a modern business. It was around this time that Charles, Lucky, Luciano entered Siegel's orbit. Luciano, ambitious and visionary, recognized that the old structure of organized crime, dominated by ethnic rivalries and traditional mafia hierarchies, was outdated. He wanted to build a syndicate that included Italians, Jews, and Irish, each contributing their strengths to a unified underworld. Luciano saw in Lansky a brilliant mind, and in Siegel a fearless enforcer whose charisma could win allies as easily as his gun eliminated enemies. The three men began working together, forging an alliance that would reshape the criminal world. The late 1920s and early 1930s were not just about profits, they were about survival. New York was filled with rival gangs, and turf wars were deadly. The Castellammarese War, a bloody conflict between rival Italian factions led by Joe, the Boss, Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, spread chaos across the city. Though Lansky and Siegel were not central players in the conflict, they watched closely and aligned themselves with Luciano, who eventually orchestrated the murders of both Masuria and Maranzano. These killings ended the old mafia order and cleared the way for Luciano to establish the Commission, a governing body that would oversee organized crime across the United States. Siegel played a role in this violent restructuring. Trusted by Lansky and Luciano, he became part of the network of killers who enforced the new order. His fearlessness made him a natural choice for such work. When the Commission was established in 1931, Siegel and Lansky stood at the heart of a revolution. They were no longer just street gangsters. They were part of a national syndicate that promised power, wealth, and influence beyond anything the old gangs had imagined. At the same time, Siegel's personal life began to reflect his dual nature. He married Esther Krakauer, a childhood sweetheart, in 1929, and the couple had 2 daughters. To his family, Siegel could be charming and attentive, a husband and father who provided a comfortable lifestyle. Yet the other side of his life was steeped in violence, late nights, and dangerous company. The tension between these two worlds was a hallmark of Siegel's life, the respectable facade on one side, the ruthless gangster on the other. With prohibition fueling their rise, the Bugs and Meyer mob became one of the most efficient criminal outfits in New York. They guarded shipments, ran speakeasies, and provided muscle for the larger syndicate. But Siegel was restless. Unlike Lansky, who thrived on strategy, Siegel wanted action. He relished the nightlife, the women, the danger. His charm won him admirers in high society, and he began to frequent nightclubs where entertainers, politicians, and criminals mingled. His ability to straddle these worlds made him valuable not just as a gangster but as a connector, someone who could bring together people from vastly different backgrounds. By the early 1930s, Prohibition was nearing its end. The Great Depression had reshaped America, and by 1933, the government was preparing to repeal the alcohol ban. For most bootleggers, this spelled disaster. But for Siegel and Lansky, it was simply another opportunity. They had already diversified into gambling, narcotics, and loan sharking. More importantly, they were now tied into Luciano's syndicate, which ensured that their influence would not fade with the return of legal alcohol. Siegel's reputation, however, continued to grow as one of violence. Within the underworld, he became associated with Murder Incorporated, the enforcement arm of the syndicate responsible for carrying out contract killings nationwide. Though records of his direct involvement remained shadowy, stories circulated of Siegel carrying out hits with cold precision, driving home the point that he was not just a flashy figure but a man whose violence underpinned his reputation. Despite this darkness, Siegel cultivated an image that set him apart. He dressed impeccably, moved with confidence, and carried himself more like a movie star than a gangster. Women were drawn to him, and men wanted his approval. He had an almost magnetic charisma, and he understood the power of appearances. In a world where fear commanded respect, Siegel combined intimidation with allure, making him a figure both feared and admired. During this time, Siegel's friendship with Lansky remained unshakable. Their shared vision, nurtured under the mentorship of Rothstein and the leadership of Luciano, propelled them into the top ranks of organized crime. Siegel was not the strategist. He left that to Lansky, but his loyalty, combined with his ability to enforce decisions, made him indispensable. In many ways, Siegel was the face of their partnership, the one who commanded attention, while Lansky worked quietly behind the scenes. By the mid-1930s, Siegel's role in the syndicate had expanded. He was trusted with larger operations, sent to handle disputes, and increasingly involved in national crime matters. His restlessness, however, was beginning to show. New York was becoming crowded, and Siegel, with his love of glamour and action, was starting to look westward. The allure of Hollywood, with its stars, money, and endless possibilities, called to him. While Lansky remained firmly rooted in the syndicate structure, Siegel dreamed of new territories where he could build his own empire. For now, though, Siegel remained in New York, continuing to cement his reputation as both a ruthless killer and a charming socialite. The Prohibition years had given him wealth and status, but they had also revealed the contradictions within him: the family man and the gangster, the loyal friend and the unpredictable killer, the street tough and the budding celebrity. He was a man caught between worlds, and as the 1930s unfolded, those contradictions would shape his path toward even greater power, and ultimately, toward the legacy that still surrounds his name today. By the mid-1930s, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel stood at a crossroads. The end of Prohibition had closed one of the most profitable chapters in organized crime, yet the syndicate built by Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and their closest allies was thriving in new ventures. Gambling, narcotics, labor racketeering, and loan sharking filled the void left by alcohol. Siegel, who had proven himself as both a fearless enforcer and a charismatic presence, now sought a new stage for his ambitions. Restless and unwilling to remain confined to New York's crowded underworld, his eyes turned westward, toward Hollywood, a place of glamour, money, and opportunity, where he believed his future lay. The idea of expansion into Los Angeles was not entirely new. For years, the East Coast mob had eyed the city as a potential hub. The West Coast offered proximity to Mexican and Pacific smuggling routes, a growing film industry, and a booming population with a taste for gambling and nightlife. But the territory was loosely controlled by local outfits, including the Italian mob under Jack Dragna and various independent operators who lacked the organizational discipline of New York's syndicate. To Siegel, Los Angeles was a land of untapped potential, and his charm and violence made him uniquely suited to conquer it. In 1937, Siegel officially relocated to California, leaving behind his wife and daughters in New York. The move symbolized not only his ambitions but also his growing estrangement from his family life. In Los Angeles, Siegel reinvented himself. He rented lavish homes, drove expensive cars, and cultivated relationships with Hollywood's elite. Unlike most gangsters, who kept their dealings hidden in the shadows, Siegel embraced the spotlight. He attended glamorous parties, mingled with actors, directors, and producers, and quickly became a familiar face in social circles that rarely admitted men of his background. Among his many connections, Siegel struck up friendships with some of Hollywood's most famous names. He was known to dine with Clark Gable, Cary Grant, and Jean Harlow. He was especially close to George Raft, the actor whose portrayals of gangsters on screen mirrored Siegel's life off-screen. Raft admired Siegel's confidence and feared him in equal measure, and their association opened more doors into Hollywood's inner circles. For Siegel, this blending of underworld reputation and celebrity culture was intoxicating. He reveled in the attention, projecting the image of a gangster who was not only feared but admired by America's cultural elite. But Siegel was not in Los Angeles merely for parties. He was there to establish the syndicate's dominance. One of his first targets was the local bookmaking business, a lucrative racket in the movie capital where stars and studio executives placed bets as freely as they bought champagne. Siegel muscled his way into the market, offering both protection and intimidation. His methods were effective. Competitors quickly realized that resistance often ended with a beating, a firebomb, or worse. Siegel's reputation preceded him, and few dared to challenge him directly. At the same time, Siegel cultivated relationships with studio executives and financiers, some of whom were eager to invest in his gambling ventures. Hollywood was a city built on illusions, and Siegel fit right in, part gangster, part movie star. His presence blurred the line between fantasy and reality. Yet beneath the glamour, the violence was never far away. Stories circulated of Siegel pistol-whipping rivals or flying into rages that ended in gunfire. His dual persona, a man who could charm a Hollywood starlet at dinner and execute an enemy in the same evening, made him both fascinating and terrifying. The late 1930s also brought Siegel deeper into the world of narcotics trafficking. The West Coast offered prime routes for smuggling heroin from Asia and Mexico, and Siegel sought to expand the syndicate's influence in this area. Law enforcement suspected his involvement, though concrete evidence was scarce. What was clear was that Siegel's empire was growing, and his ambitions were far greater than those of the local mobsters he encountered. His dominance in Los Angeles, however, was not uncontested. Jack Dragna, the so-called boss of Los Angeles, saw Siegel as an interloper encroaching on his territory. The two men maintained an uneasy relationship, marked by negotiations and occasional flare-ups of violence. Siegel's ties to Lansky and Luciano gave him the backing of the East Coast Syndicate, ensuring that Dragna could not easily move against him. In effect, Siegel became the syndicate's representative in California, with the authority to act as he pleased. Meanwhile, Siegel's personal life in Los Angeles reflected his growing detachment from the life he had left behind in New York. His marriage to Esther Krakauer deteriorated, and his affairs became the subject of gossip in both Hollywood and the underworld. He was linked romantically to actresses and socialites, most notably Virginia Hill, a fiery woman whose beauty and cunning matched Siegel's own charisma. Hill, who would later become inseparably tied to Siegel's story, represented the merging of his two worlds, the glamorous Hollywood scene and the ruthless underworld empire. By the time World War II erupted in 1939, Siegel was firmly entrenched in Los Angeles. The war years brought new opportunities for organized crime, as rationing and shortages created black markets for goods ranging from meat to gasoline. Siegel, ever adaptable, extended his reach into these ventures while maintaining his grip on gambling and bookmaking. Yet his ambitions were already stretching beyond California. He envisioned creating something grander, something that would outshine all other ventures in the syndicate's history. That dream, though still distant in the early 1940s, would eventually lead him to the deserts of Nevada. Despite his successes, Siegel remained unpredictable. His temper, which had earned him the nickname Bugsy in his youth, continued to surface. Associates described him as charming one moment and violent the next. In one infamous incident, Siegel allegedly beat a man nearly to death for disrespecting him at a nightclub, only to return to the party minutes later as though nothing had happened. Such episodes reinforced his reputation as a man to be both admired and feared. Law enforcement, too, began to take greater notice of Siegel's activities. The Los Angeles Police Department kept a close watch on him, and the FBI compiled extensive files documenting his movements, associates, and suspected crimes. Yet Siegel was adept at evading prosecution. His connections in Hollywood and politics provided him with protection, while witnesses were often too terrified to testify against him. Like many top figures in organized crime, Siegel thrived in the shadows of evidence too thin to secure convictions. By the early 1940s, Siegel had transformed himself from a New York enforcer into a national figure. His life in Los Angeles combined the brutality of organized crime with the allure of Hollywood stardom. He was no longer just a gangster, he was a cultural icon, embodying both the dangers and the seductions of the criminal world. The press covered his exploits with fascination, often blurring fact and legend. To the public, Bugsy Siegel was as much a character as any played on the silver screen, a man whose story seemed too outrageous to be true, yet whose reality was even darker. What made Siegel stand out from other gangsters of his time was not just his violence or his wealth, but his vision. He saw beyond the immediate profits of gambling and racketeering. He dreamed of building something lasting, something that would combine the spectacle of Hollywood with the power of organized crime. That vision would eventually take form in Las Vegas. But even in the late 1930s and early 1940s, the seeds were already planted. Siegel's move to Los Angeles was more than just a change of scenery. It was the first step toward reshaping the very image of the American gangster. As the war raged abroad and America's cities bustled with new energy, Bugsy Siegel continued to straddle two worlds: the brutal, violent underworld of organized crime and the glamorous, intoxicating world of Hollywood high society. It was a balancing act that few could maintain, and for Siegel, it was only a matter of time before these two worlds collided in ways that would define his legacy forever. The early 1940s marked a decisive turning point in the life of Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. He had established himself as the dominant East Coast syndicate representative in Los Angeles, commanding respect and fear in equal measure. His network spanned gambling, bookmaking, narcotics smuggling, and Hollywood connections that blurred the line between crime and celebrity culture. Yet beneath the surface, Siegel's ambitions were growing restless. He was no longer content with being merely another gangster living off rackets and intimidation. He dreamed of building an empire unlike anything the underworld had ever attempted, and as the decade unfolded, those dreams began to take shape in the deserts of Nevada. Los Angeles in the early 1940s was a city buzzing with wartime energy. The film industry was thriving, and the war effort had flooded California with jobs, money, and soldiers. For Siegel, the environment offered fertile ground. Gambling dens flourished in Hollywood and Beverly Hills, frequented by actors, producers, and military men seeking thrills after long days in factories or training camps. Siegel controlled much of this scene, ensuring that bets flowed through his hands and profits lined his pockets. At the same time, his black market ventures grew, with rationing creating demand for everything from meat to gasoline. If there was money to be made, Siegel found a way to make it. It was during this period that Virginia Hill became a central figure in his life. Hill, a sharp, ambitious woman from Alabama, had already made her mark in Chicago as an associate of the Chicago outfit. Known as the Flamingo, for her fiery personality and striking red hair, she had a talent for navigating both the underworld and high society. Siegel and Hill's relationship was passionate, volatile, and deeply intertwined with business. She served as both lover and confidant, while also acting as a trusted courier for syndicate money. Hill's connections and fearlessness made her invaluable, and together, the two projected an image of glamour and danger that fascinated both Hollywood insiders and the press. Their relationship also reflected Siegel's growing estrangement from his wife, Esta, and his daughters back in New York. By the early 1940s, his marriage was effectively over, though not formally dissolved. In Los Angeles, Siegel built a new life, one that revolved around Hill, parties with movie stars, and the expanding world of organized crime. Yet even as he basked in the glow of Hollywood, his mind drifted to larger ambitions. The seeds of Las Vegas were already sprouting in these years. Nevada had legalized gambling in 1931, but the industry remained small and disorganized, dominated by low-rent casinos and cowboy entrepreneurs. To Siegel, the state represented a blank canvas. Here was a place where gambling could be transformed into something larger than life, a spectacle that combined the allure of Hollywood with the profits of organized crime. The idea of building a world-class resort in the Nevada desert began to take hold in his imagination, though at first it was little more than a dream. The war years also deepened Siegel's involvement in narcotics. Law enforcement reports from the early 1940s suggested that he played a key role in smuggling heroin through Mexico and into California, taking advantage of West Coast shipping lanes and his connections to international suppliers. The profits were immense, and though drug trafficking carried more risk than gambling or bookmaking, it also offered rewards that few could resist. Siegel's ability to juggle multiple enterprises, gambling, narcotics, Hollywood rackets, spoke to his versatility, but it also stretched his resources thin. Despite his growing power, Siegel's temper and unpredictability remained a constant threat. Stories circulated in Los Angeles of sudden outbursts of violence, of rivals beaten or shot for minor offenses, of Siegel walking into nightclubs with the swagger of a movie star and the menace of a killer. His nickname, Bugsy, still followed him, though he despised it. To his face, few dared utter it, knowing that Siegel's response was often explosive. He preferred simply Ben, a name that softened his image, especially in the company of Hollywood elites who were drawn to his charisma. By 1944, Siegel's role in the national syndicate was shifting. With Lucky Luciano imprisoned since 1936, Meyer Lansky had emerged as one of the leading figures in organized crime, acting as strategist and mediator among the syndicate's various factions. Lansky trusted Siegel deeply, and the two remained close. Yet Lansky also recognized Siegel's volatility, and he worried about his friend's excesses in Los Angeles. Nevertheless, when Siegel began speaking of grander plans in Nevada, Lansky and others in the syndicate listened. The idea of building a syndicate-controlled casino resort had enormous appeal, especially as Las Vegas was still largely untouched by organized crime at the national level. The first serious steps toward this vision began with the purchase of land in Las Vegas. The project that would eventually become the Flamingo Hotel started under William Wilkerson, a Los Angeles businessman and founder of The Hollywood Reporter. Wilkerson envisioned a luxury casino and resort unlike anything then existing in Las Vegas. But Wilkerson lacked the financial muscle to complete his dream. That's where Siegel came in. Through Hill and other intermediaries, Siegel maneuvered himself into the project, eventually muscling Wilkerson out. By late 1945, Siegel had taken control of the Flamingo, and construction began on what he promised would be the most glamorous casino in the world. For Siegel, the Flamingo represented more than just a business opportunity. It was his chance to legitimize himself, to step out of the shadows of the underworld and become a public figure of wealth and sophistication. He envisioned a resort that would attract Hollywood stars, millionaires, and tourists alike, combining fine dining, luxury accommodations, and high-stakes gambling under one roof. The project was bold, visionary, and enormously expensive. Back in Los Angeles, Siegel continued to operate his rackets, but his attention increasingly shifted to Nevada. The syndicate, at first supportive, began to grow concerned about the escalating costs of the Flamingo. Construction was plagued by delays, rising prices, and Siegel's own tendency to spend extravagantly. What was initially projected as a modest investment ballooned into millions of dollars. Still, Siegel pressed on, convinced that his vision would succeed. As the mid-1940s progressed, tensions mounted. Siegel's reputation as a ruthless enforcer remained intact, but his role was evolving. No longer merely the muscle of the syndicate, he was now positioning himself as a businessman, albeit one backed by mob money and intimidation. His Hollywood connections provided him with prestige, while his relationship with Virginia Hill symbolized both his charm and his volatility. Together, they embodied the glamorous, dangerous allure of organized crime in wartime America. Law enforcement pressure, however, was intensifying. The FBI tracked Siegel's movements, and newspapers followed his exploits with fascination. The Los Angeles Times and other outlets painted him as a larger-than-life figure, a gangster who mingled with celebrities and dreamed of reshaping Las Vegas. Yet despite the attention, Siegel managed to avoid serious convictions, a testament to both his cunning and the fear he inspired in potential witnesses. By the end of World War II, Siegel was standing on the edge of a new era. The Flamingo was under construction, Hollywood remained under his influence, and his syndicate connections gave him resources few could match. But cracks were beginning to appear. His extravagant spending, his growing detachment from day-to-day rackets, and his temper were alienating allies. While he envisioned the future of organized crime in the deserts of Nevada, others in the syndicate began to question whether Bugsy Siegel was the right man to lead them into it. For Siegel, however, there was no turning back. He had staked his reputation and his future on the Flamingo, and he was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. The 1940s had already transformed him from an enforcer into a visionary, but the gamble he was about to take would either secure his legacy as one of the most influential figures in organized crime, or seal his downfall in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. By 1945, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel had crossed the threshold. He was no longer simply a gangster who commanded respect through fear and violence. He was now a man chasing a dream, one that he believed would elevate him above the underworld entirely. That dream was embodied in the Flamingo Hotel, a luxury resort rising out of the Nevada desert. But as construction dragged on and costs spiraled, Siegel's grand vision became a dangerous gamble, not just for himself but for the syndicate that had backed him. The Flamingo began as the brainchild of William R. Wilkerson, a wealthy Los Angeles businessman and founder of The Hollywood Reporter. Wilkerson had envisioned a first-class casino and hotel that would rival the finest establishments in Europe. He bought land on Highway 91, just outside the small town of Las Vegas, which at the time was little more than a dusty railroad stop with a handful of gaming halls. Wilkerson dreamed of lush gardens, sparkling pools, and a resort that would draw Hollywood stars away from California to play in the desert. But Wilkerson lacked the financing to turn his vision into reality. That's when Siegel entered the picture. Using Virginia Hill and other intermediaries, Siegel approached Wilkerson and offered the syndicate's financial support. At first, Wilkerson agreed, but he soon found himself pushed aside. By mid-1945, Siegel had muscled him out entirely, taking control of the project. For Siegel, the Flamingo was no longer just Wilkerson's dream. It was his opportunity to leave behind the image of a gangster and step into the role of legitimate businessman and visionary. Construction began in earnest, but almost immediately, problems arose. The Nevada desert proved a difficult environment for building, with shortages of materials caused by the end of World War II and labor disputes slowing progress. Costs escalated quickly. What had begun as a project with a budget of about $1 million soon doubled, then tripled. By the time Siegel was deep into construction, the bill had ballooned to $6 million, an astronomical sum for the era. Siegel's own management style made matters worse. He had little patience for delays or excuses, and his notorious temper often exploded at contractors, workers, or suppliers. Stories circulated of Siegel threatening, or even assaulting, those who crossed him. At the same time, he siphoned off funds for his own use, pouring money into his lavish lifestyle with Virginia Hill. Hill herself was rumored to be transporting large sums of Flamingo money to Swiss bank accounts, a claim that only fueled syndicate suspicions. Despite the mounting problems, Siegel pressed on. To him, the Flamingo was more than just a casino. It was a chance to redefine organized crime. Instead of smoky backroom gambling dens and seedy rackets, he envisioned a resort that would attract millionaires, celebrities, and high rollers. The Flamingo would combine luxury with gambling, creating a new model for casinos that could be replicated across Nevada and beyond. Siegel believed the investment would pay off in ways the syndicate could scarcely imagine. His partners were less convinced. Meyer Lansky, Siegel's lifelong friend and ally, had originally supported the project, convinced by Siegel's charm and vision. But as costs soared, Lansky found himself in a difficult position. He had to reassure other syndicate leaders, men like Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, and the Chicago outfit, that their money was not being wasted. Many of them began to lose patience. They saw Siegel not as a visionary but as a liability, someone who had lost control of his project, and by extension, his usefulness to the syndicate. Still, Lansky urged them to wait. He argued that Siegel deserved the chance to prove himself. After all, the Flamingo was nearly complete, and if it succeeded, the profits would be immense. But Lansky's defense could only hold for so long. By late 1946, the syndicate's patience was wearing thin. In December of that year, Siegel made his move. Determined to prove his critics wrong, he pushed to open the Flamingo ahead of schedule, even though construction was far from finished. The hotel rooms were incomplete, the air conditioning barely worked, and the landscaping remained barren desert. Still, Siegel was convinced that a flashy opening would generate excitement and draw in Hollywood's elite. On December 26, 1946, the Flamingo officially opened its doors. The grand opening was a spectacle. Siegel invited stars from Hollywood, including actors, producers, and socialites, promising them a glamorous getaway unlike anything they had ever seen. The casino sparkled with neon lights, dealers stood ready at blackjack and roulette tables, and an orchestra played for the guests. Virginia Hill, ever the hostess, mingled with celebrities, projecting the image of sophistication Siegel craved. But the reality fell short. Construction delays meant that the hotel portion of the Flamingo was not yet operational, forcing guests to stay elsewhere. The lack of finished amenities left many disappointed. Worse, the opening coincided with heavy rainstorms, dampening the desert glamour Siegel had promised. Attendance was lower than expected, and the casino took in far less money than needed. Instead of the triumphant debut Siegel envisioned, the Flamingo's opening was widely seen as a flop. Siegel, however, refused to admit defeat. He closed the casino after only a few weeks, determined to finish construction and reopen properly. He poured more money into the project, overseeing every detail, from the color of the carpets to the selection of entertainers. By spring of 1947, the Flamingo was finally completed, with hotel rooms, a swimming pool, and lush gardens ready for guests. The casino reopened, and this time business began to improve. High rollers arrived, Hollywood stars visited, and money started flowing. But by then, it was too late. The syndicate had already decided that Siegel's mismanagement could not be overlooked. The costs had soared to over $6 million, and suspicions about missing funds, particularly the money Virginia Hill was said to have funneled overseas, hung over him. While the Flamingo was finally making money, it would take years to recoup the investment, and the syndicate was unwilling to wait. Lansky once again tried to defend Siegel, arguing that the Flamingo was now on the path to success. But others had already lost faith. To them, Siegel had squandered too much money, alienated too many allies, and proven too unpredictable. For all his charm and vision, he was still the volatile Bugsy they had always known. And in the syndicate, failure, especially expensive failure, was rarely forgiven. By mid-1947, Siegel's fate was sealed. The same dream that he believed would elevate him beyond gangsterdom had instead placed him squarely in the crosshairs of the very organization that had supported him. He had built the Flamingo, but in doing so, he had also built the conditions for his own downfall. The final act of Siegel's life was approaching. In Beverly Hills, where he and Virginia Hill lived in luxury, he continued to act as though nothing was wrong. He entertained guests, made plans for the future, and spoke proudly of the Flamingo's prospects. But behind the scenes, decisions were being made that would end his story in the most brutal way imaginable. For Bugsy Siegel, the Flamingo was both the pinnacle of his ambition and the beginning of his undoing. What had started as a vision of glamour and success had become a costly gamble, one that even he could not win. And as the desert sun blazed over Las Vegas, the man who dreamed of turning sand into gold was running out of time. In the spring of 1947, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel stood at a crossroads. On the surface, he seemed to have it all. He lived in a luxurious Beverly Hills mansion with Virginia Hill, the fiery redhead who had been both his lover and partner in crime. He mingled with movie stars, politicians, and high society figures, continuing to cultivate the image of a man who had successfully crossed from gangster to legitimate businessman. But beneath the veneer of glamour, his world was beginning to crumble. The Flamingo, his crowning achievement, had nearly bankrupted the syndicate and alienated powerful allies. The very men who had once backed him were now questioning whether he was worth the risk of keeping alive. The Flamingo had reopened in March 1947 after its disastrous debut the previous December. By this time, the hotel rooms were complete, the gardens landscaped, and the entertainment lineup polished. Siegel spared no expense in hiring top acts and making the Flamingo the most elegant destination in Las Vegas. The gamble seemed to be paying off. Celebrities from Hollywood, Clark Gable, Lana Turner, and others, began arriving. Gamblers filled the tables, and revenue finally began to flow into the casino's coffers. Yet, the improvement came too late. For the mob, the issue was not just money, it was trust. The Flamingo's costs had ballooned to over $6 million, much of it unaccounted for. Rumors swirled that Siegel and Hill had siphoned funds into secret accounts in Switzerland. The syndicate, led by men like Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, and the Chicago bosses, demanded answers. Meyer Lansky, Siegel's oldest friend, continued to defend him, insisting that the Flamingo would turn into a gold mine. But even Lansky's influence had limits. The rest of the syndicate no longer saw Siegel as an asset, they saw him as a liability. Siegel, however, remained either unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the danger he was in. He continued to live lavishly, hosting parties and acting with the same swagger that had defined his rise. Friends recalled that he seemed convinced the Flamingo would cement his legacy and ensure his place among the syndicate's elite. But others noticed cracks. Siegel's temper grew more unpredictable. He lashed out at associates, berated employees, and suspected betrayal at every corner. For a man who had built his reputation on charm and ruthlessness, paranoia was beginning to take over. Virginia Hill, meanwhile, had become a lightning rod for suspicion. Known for her sharp wit and extravagant lifestyle, she frequently traveled abroad, often to Switzerland. The mob bosses became convinced that Siegel was funneling Flamingo money to Hill, who was allegedly depositing it into secret accounts. Whether or not this was true remains debated, but the perception was enough to damage Siegel's standing further. Hill herself seemed increasingly weary of Siegel's volatility. Their relationship, once passionate, had turned toxic, marred by arguments, jealousy, and physical confrontations. By early June 1947, Hill had left for Europe once again, ostensibly to handle business matters. Some later speculated that she was sent away deliberately, perhaps to remove her from danger or because she had already betrayed Siegel by confirming the mob's suspicions. In her absence, Siegel was left vulnerable, surrounded by enemies and with fewer allies than ever before. The decision to eliminate Siegel was not taken lightly. He was, after all, one of the syndicate's most visible figures, a man who had played a pivotal role in building their empire. But his recklessness, his inability to control costs, and his suspected embezzlement left little room for mercy. By mid-June, the order had been given. Meyer Lansky, though heartbroken, did not stand in the way. For all his loyalty to Siegel, Lansky understood the rules of their world. The syndicate valued discipline, profit, and obedience above all else. Siegel had failed on all three counts. In the days leading up to his death, Siegel continued to act as though the Flamingo's recent success had secured his position. He spoke proudly of the casino's future, boasted about upcoming improvements, and assured friends that the venture would make everyone rich. But there were also signs that he sensed the walls closing in. He reportedly confided to a friend that he feared for his life, though he laughed it off in the next breath, as though daring fate to challenge him. On the night of June 20, 1947, Siegel returned to Virginia Hill's rented mansion at 810 North Linden Drive in Beverly Hills. Hill was in Europe, but Siegel had been using the house as his own. That evening, he entertained his associate Alan Smiley and relaxed in the living room. Newspapers lay scattered on the sofa where he sat, reading by the glow of a lamp. Outside, someone waited with a .30 caliber M1 carbine, positioned to fire through the window. At approximately 10:45 p.m., a burst of gunfire shattered the quiet Beverly Hills night. 9 shots were fired. 4 of them struck Siegel, 2 in the head and 2 in the torso. One bullet destroyed his right eye, killing him instantly. Smiley, miraculously, was unharmed. He later told investigators that he had ducked for cover as glass and wood splintered around him. The scene was one of chaos and shock. Newspapers would soon publish photographs of Siegel's body slumped on the sofa, his once handsome face grotesquely disfigured. The images became infamous, a stark symbol of the brutal reality of organized crime. For all of Siegel's charm, vision, and ambition, his end had been as violent and unceremonious as any street thug's. News of his death spread quickly. In Las Vegas, syndicate associates wasted no time. Within hours of Siegel's murder, Gus Greenbaum, a trusted mob figure, was installed as the new overseer of the Flamingo. The casino's operations continued without interruption, as though Siegel had never been there. The message was clear: no individual, no matter how influential, was bigger than the organization. The identity of Siegel's killer has never been definitively proven. Some suspected that syndicate gunmen carried out the hit on direct orders from Chicago or New York. Others believed that it may have been the work of someone closer, perhaps an associate with personal grievances. Over the years, names like Mo Sedway and Gus Greenbaum have surfaced in connection with the plot, though no charges were ever brought. Virginia Hill, questioned upon her return from Europe, denied any knowledge of the murder and claimed to be devastated by Siegel's death. Whether she truly was or whether she had played a role in setting him up remains one of organized crime's enduring mysteries. Siegel's assassination marked a turning point not just for his own story but for the history of Las Vegas. The Flamingo, despite its rocky beginnings, would go on to become a success, paving the way for the transformation of the city into the gambling capital of the world. Siegel had been right about the potential of Las Vegas, but he would never live to see his vision realized. Others reaped the rewards of the empire he had imagined, while he was remembered as the man who paid the ultimate price for ambition. In death, Siegel became a legend. Newspapers across the country ran headlines about the gangster slain in Beverly Hills. Some described him as a ruthless killer who had gotten what he deserved, while others painted him as a tragic figure undone by his own dreams. Hollywood, which had once embraced him, now treated him as a cautionary tale. Friends and enemies alike agreed on one thing: Bugsy Siegel had lived, and died, on his own terms, fearless until the very end. His funeral, held in Los Angeles, was attended by family and a handful of associates, though few major mob figures dared to appear. Meyer Lansky, deeply shaken, stayed away, but those close to him later said that Siegel's death haunted him for the rest of his life. For Lansky, losing Siegel was not just the death of a friend but a reminder of the unforgiving rules of the underworld they had chosen. Bugsy Siegel's life had been a contradiction from start to finish, a man who dreamed of legitimacy but built his fortune on crime, a gangster who courted Hollywood stars while ordering hits in back alleys, a visionary who saw the future of Las Vegas yet could not escape his violent past. His story was not simply one of crime but of ambition, hubris, and the price of defying the syndicate. As the desert city grew into the glittering oasis he had envisioned, Bugsy Siegel's ghost lingered in its neon lights, a reminder that the bright promise of Las Vegas was born out of blood. On the night of June 20th, 1947, when gunfire shattered the quiet in Beverly Hills and ended Benjamin, Bugsy, Siegel's life, the world of organized crime did not skip a beat. Within hours of the assassination, the Flamingo Hotel, Siegel's dream project and the source of his undoing, had new management. In Las Vegas, syndicate figures Mo Sedway and Gus Greenbaum walked into the casino and assumed control, acting with the confidence of men who knew their takeover had been prearranged. While Siegel's body was still warm in California, the mob made it clear that business would continue, and no individual, however ambitious or reckless, would ever stand above the collective will of the organization. The assassination sent shockwaves through Hollywood and across the country. Newspapers carried lurid photographs of Siegel's corpse, slumped in Virginia Hill's Beverly Hills living room, his right eye destroyed by a bullet. The images became iconic, a grotesque reminder of how even glamorous gangsters could not escape the fate that awaited those who crossed the syndicate. For many Americans, Siegel's death seemed to confirm what they had long suspected, that organized crime was as ruthless in policing itself as it was in extorting others. Virginia Hill, whose name was already entangled in Siegel's financial controversies, was abroad when the murder occurred. She had been in Paris and later Switzerland, allegedly on personal business but widely suspected of moving mob funds into hidden accounts. When she returned to the United States weeks later, she denied any knowledge of the assassination and claimed to be devastated by Siegel's death. Law enforcement grilled her about the rumors of missing Flamingo funds and her supposed betrayal of Siegel, but no evidence was ever produced to tie her directly to the conspiracy. Hill herself insisted that Siegel had been the great love of her life, though those who knew her remained skeptical. The mob wasted no time in solidifying its hold on Las Vegas. Mose Sedway, one of Meyer Lansky's loyal operatives, and Gus Greenbaum, who had proven himself by managing mob-run casinos in Chicago, were installed as overseers of the Flamingo. Unlike Siegel, they were not visionaries, but they were disciplined, efficient, and above all, obedient to the commission. Under their management, the Flamingo quickly stabilized. The construction was completed, operations smoothed out, and the casino finally began to generate consistent profits. The dream Siegel had envisioned, a luxurious desert resort that combined gambling, entertainment, and Hollywood glamour, was realized, but it happened without him. In a bitter twist, Siegel had been right all along about Las Vegas. The Flamingo became the first of many mob-financed resorts that would transform the city into a global gambling capital. Over the following decades, Las Vegas grew into a neon empire, drawing millions of visitors and billions in revenue. The syndicate reaped enormous rewards, funneling money from the casinos back into their criminal networks nationwide. Siegel, the man who had first seen the city's potential, became a ghostly figure in its history, remembered not as the successful casino magnate he had hoped to be, but as the visionary who had paid with his life for being ahead of his time. The identity of Siegel's killer remains one of organized crime's most enduring mysteries. No one was ever charged, and speculation has swirled for decades. Some accounts point to Chicago mobsters, particularly those aligned with the outfit, who had invested heavily in the Flamingo and demanded accountability for its losses. Others suggest the hit was sanctioned by the commission itself, with leaders like Frank Costello and Joe Adonis agreeing that Siegel's recklessness endangered their collective enterprise. Still others whisper that someone closer to Siegel, perhaps Mose Sedway or even Virginia Hill, played a role. But like so many mob assassinations, the truth was buried with those who ordered it. For Meyer Lansky, Siegel's death was both a personal tragedy and a practical necessity. Lansky had been Siegel's closest friend since their teenage years in New York, when they ran the streets as part of the Bugs and Meyer mob. He had defended Siegel repeatedly before the syndicate, insisting that the Flamingo would succeed. But when the time came, Lansky did not intervene. Those who knew him later said he was haunted by Siegel's death, yet he understood the rules of their world. No one was indispensable, and loyalty could not outweigh the survival of the organization. The aftermath of Siegel's murder also reshaped the mob's approach to Las Vegas. Where Siegel had relied on charisma, showmanship, and a volatile personality, the new overseers emphasized discipline and careful management. Greenbaum, in particular, became known for his ability to run casinos efficiently while ensuring the mob's skim, the siphoning of untaxed cash directly to syndicate bosses, was reliable and secure. This system of skimming would define Las Vegas for decades, with millions flowing out of casino count rooms and into mob coffers in New York, Chicago, and beyond. Siegel's violent end also reinforced a lesson to anyone operating within the syndicate: ambition was tolerated, but betrayal, recklessness, or disobedience were not. The mob had always been ruthless in policing itself, and Siegel's assassination became a cautionary tale. His death was not just about missing money. It was about sending a message that no one, not even a man with friends as powerful as Meyer Lansky or connections as glittering as Hollywood, could defy the organization and live. In the months after Siegel's murder, law enforcement redoubled efforts to investigate the Flamingo and the syndicate's presence in Las Vegas. The FBI, still under J. Edgar Hoover's leadership, remained reluctant to acknowledge the full scale of organized crime, but local authorities pressed inquiries into the casino's financing. These investigations turned up little concrete evidence. The mob's control of Las Vegas remained largely invisible to outsiders, hidden behind layers of front men and legitimate businesses. For the public, the Flamingo became a glamorous destination. Few visitors realized that every dollar gambled on its tables was feeding a vast criminal enterprise. Meanwhile, Virginia Hill's reputation spiraled. She was subpoenaed by the Kefauver Committee in 1951, where she testified about her life with Siegel and her connections to organized crime figures. On the stand, she remained defiant, denying knowledge of any syndicate operations and portraying herself as a woman caught up in circumstances beyond her control. Yet her lavish lifestyle, frequent trips abroad, and association with notorious figures left her credibility in tatters. For the rest of her life, she would be dogged by the shadow of Siegel's murder and the suspicions that she had betrayed him. The legend of Bugsy Siegel began to grow almost immediately after his death. Newspapers and magazines portrayed him as both a ruthless killer and a tragic dreamer, a man undone by his own excesses and ambitions. Hollywood, which had once embraced him as a charming rogue, now transformed him into a symbol of the dark glamour of organized crime. Over the decades, films and books would romanticize Siegel, portraying him as the man who gave birth to modern Las Vegas. The reality was more complex. Siegel had indeed seen the potential of the desert city, but he had also bled it dry with his mismanagement, and nearly destroyed it before it had begun. By the late 1940s, Las Vegas was firmly under mob control, and Siegel was reduced to a cautionary tale whispered in back rooms. His name still carried weight, but not as he had intended. To the syndicate, he was remembered less as a visionary than as a lesson in what happened when ambition was not tempered by discipline. Yet to the city he helped shape, he remained forever linked to its identity. The Flamingo, though remodeled and expanded beyond recognition, stood as a monument to his dream and his downfall. Bugsy Siegel's assassination marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The chaotic, flamboyant style of gangster rule that he embodied gave way to a colder, more efficient system of mob dominance. In that system, the individual mattered less than the enterprise. Siegel's story, glamorous and brutal, became a chapter in the larger saga of organized crime's rise in America. A reminder that beneath the neon lights of Las Vegas lay a foundation built on blood. The death of Benjamin Bugsy Siegel in 1947 marked not only the end of one man but the consolidation of a new era for Las Vegas. With Mo Sedway and Gus Greenbaum at the helm of the Flamingo, the city's first luxury casino under mob control finally began to realize the vision Siegel had so desperately pursued. Sedway and Greenbaum were nothing like Siegel, either flamboyant nor impulsive, but precise, disciplined, and utterly loyal to the syndicate. They knew that Las Vegas could be a goldmine, but only if the operations were meticulously managed, funds carefully tracked, and profits reliably skimmed. The Flamingo's transformation under Sedway and Greenbaum was dramatic. Construction delays that had plagued Siegel were quickly addressed, debts were renegotiated, and staff trained to operate efficiently. Greenbaum, who had previously managed Chicago mob-run casinos, introduced a system that ensured the syndicate would receive its cut without interference from auditors or the law. The casino's financial records were opaque, revenues were laundered through legitimate fronts, and cash flow was closely monitored. Within months, the Flamingo began to turn a profit, and the mob's faith in Las Vegas was vindicated. Greenbaum's approach contrasted sharply with Siegel's. Where Siegel had been a visionary dreamer, spending extravagantly on Hollywood connections and lavish construction, Greenbaum focused on operational control. Security protocols were tightened, cash handling became centralized and methodical. High rollers were courted, not dazzled by glamour, and the casino's entertainment, though still luxurious, was organized with precision rather than spectacle. These changes marked the beginning of Las Vegas as a city built on the discipline and organization of the syndicate rather than the capricious genius of one man. By 1948, the Flamingo was not only profitable but also set the standard for new casino resorts. Visitors flocked from across the United States, attracted by the promise of high-stakes gaming and the allure of Hollywood-adjacent luxury. Celebrities continued to arrive, not because of Siegel's charisma but because the casino had become synonymous with glamour and sophistication. The syndicate's strategy was simple yet effective, used the front of legitimate entertainment to mask the criminal machinery behind it. The city of Las Vegas was quietly becoming a cash-generating machine for organized crime. The syndicate's success in Las Vegas had ripple effects throughout the country. Money skimmed from casinos in Nevada began to fund operations in Chicago, New York, and other major cities. The mob's network of gambling, narcotics, and loan-sharking enterprises became increasingly interconnected, each operation supporting the other. The profits from the Flamingo and subsequent Las Vegas casinos allowed the syndicate to maintain power, influence politicians, and corrupt law enforcement without drawing undue attention. Siegel's original vision had been realized, but without the man himself. Meanwhile, law enforcement began to notice the growing footprint of organized crime in Las Vegas, though understanding was slow. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover was reluctant to acknowledge the national reach of the mafia, focusing primarily on communist threats during the early Cold War. Local authorities, meanwhile, were often compromised. In a city where the syndicate controlled construction permits, utilities, and law enforcement access, corruption ran deep. Investigators occasionally stumbled upon evidence of mob activity, but it rarely led to prosecution. The Flamingo, like many mob-run establishments, operated in a legal gray zone, carefully navigating around any potential scrutiny. In addition to the casino's profitability, Sedway and Greenbaum recognized the importance of controlling the local environment. They cultivated relationships with politicians, city planners, and law enforcement, ensuring that expansion plans, licenses, and permits would favor syndicate interests. Las Vegas, once a small desert town, was evolving into a city that could sustain large-scale gambling and tourism, and the mob intended to control every aspect. The foundations laid in the late 1940s would influence development for decades to come. The story of Virginia Hill also continued to evolve. Though she had returned to the United States after Siegel's assassination, she remained a figure of intrigue and suspicion. Hill had spent years moving money through international accounts, and the syndicate continued to monitor her activities closely. While she maintained her lavish lifestyle and frequent travel, she was now far removed from the day-to-day operations of Las Vegas. Her association with Siegel remained a magnet for media attention, and she continued to testify in front of congressional committees investigating organized crime in the early 1950s. Hill's testimony, while evasive, helped investigators understand the financial sophistication of mob operations, but it never led to charges against her. By 1950, Las Vegas was firmly on the path to becoming the entertainment capital of the West. New casinos, many inspired by the Flamingo model, opened across the Strip. These properties adhered to the syndicate's blueprint: efficient management, controlled cash flows, and a veneer of legitimacy. Syndicate members understood that Las Vegas offered a unique opportunity: a city with minimal oversight, a steady influx of tourists, and a gambling culture that could be exploited. Unlike Chicago or New York, Las Vegas had no entrenched legal infrastructure to hinder operations, making it an ideal playground for organized crime. The legacy of Bugsy Siegel, meanwhile, was both celebrated and vilified. Syndicate figures often spoke of him privately as a cautionary tale, an ambitious, visionary man whose brilliance was matched only by his recklessness. Hollywood continued to romanticize him, while Las Vegas used his name to attract patrons, though without acknowledging the chaos he had left behind. Siegel had been the spark, but the flames of Las Vegas were now fueled by methodical organization and the quiet efficiency of men who understood the syndicate's priorities: profit, control, and survival. The early 1950s brought additional challenges and opportunities for the syndicate. Law enforcement and congressional investigations, most notably the Kefauver Committee hearings, began to expose the extent of organized crime across the United States. Though these investigations caused a media sensation, few prosecutions were successful. Syndicate leaders learned to operate even more discreetly, using front men, shell corporations, and complex financial structures to shield their activities. Las Vegas, in particular, became a proving ground for this strategy. Casinos could operate openly as entertainment businesses while funneling substantial sums to distant syndicate bosses with minimal oversight. Greenbaum and Sedway continued to expand their influence beyond the Flamingo. They acquired other properties, established partnerships, and built a network of casinos and nightclubs that ensured a steady flow of revenue for the mob. These establishments were carefully chosen, locations that attracted high rollers, areas where local authorities were malleable, and properties that could maintain a veneer of legitimacy. Through these expansions, the syndicate turned Las Vegas into a self-sustaining economic engine for organized crime, ensuring that Siegel's vision, though completed posthumously, would leave a permanent mark on the city. By the mid-1950s, Las Vegas was no longer a small desert town with a few gambling halls. It had become a symbol of American excess, glamour, and opportunity, built on a foundation of criminal enterprise. The Flamingo, once the site of Siegel's dreams and failures, had become a template for subsequent developments, demonstrating that with discipline, oversight, and ruthlessness, the mob could generate enormous wealth in plain sight. Siegel's death, while tragic, had indirectly ensured the syndicate's continued dominance. The story of Las Vegas in this period also reflected broader trends in post-war America: rapid urbanization, the rise of mass entertainment, and the increasing mobility of wealth and people. Syndicate leaders understood these forces better than most, exploiting them to create casinos that were both destinations and cash machines. The Flamingo's success demonstrated that organized crime could adapt to modern capitalism, using the veneer of legality to conceal illicit operations. Siegel had been the visionary, but Greenbaum and Sedway were the executors, translating ambition into sustainable enterprise. The legacy of Siegel and the Flamingo would reverberate for decades. Future mob-controlled casinos in Las Vegas would adhere to the same model, combining glitz with discipline, spectacle with strategy. Syndicate profits funded operations across the United States, strengthened political influence, and cemented organized crime as a formidable national force. Siegel's role in this transformation was paradoxical. He had been the man who imagined Las Vegas' potential, yet his death ensured that it would succeed under more cautious, controlled hands. By the early 1950s, Las Vegas was emerging as a hub for high-stakes gambling, its neon-lit skyline a symbol of ambition, risk, and the silent power of organized crime. The Flamingo had stabilized under the management of Mose Sedway and Gus Greenbaum, and other syndicate-backed ventures were beginning to take shape along what would become the Las Vegas Strip. What Siegel had started as a personal dream had become a blueprint for a new kind of enterprise, one that melded legitimate business with illicit oversight, turning the desert city into a cash-generating machine for the mafia. The Flamingo's early success emboldened syndicate leaders to expand. Meyer Lansky, who had long seen the potential of Las Vegas as a money-laundering and profit-generating hub, encouraged investment in additional casinos and entertainment venues. Syndicate associates from New York, Chicago, and Cleveland provided financial backing and operational expertise, ensuring that the mob could maintain control while shielding themselves from direct legal exposure. Each new property followed a careful formula. Front men were installed to act as legitimate managers, internal accounting ensured steady profits, and security was tightened to prevent theft or disruption. Nevada's regulatory environment was permissive, which worked in the mob's favor. Licensing requirements were minimal, and oversight was limited. Local authorities, often dependent on the economic growth generated by casinos, turned a blind eye to syndicate influence. Meanwhile, federal law enforcement agencies remained largely unaware of the scale of operations, constrained by limited jurisdiction and the FBI's focus on national security threats during the early Cold War. The combination of lax oversight and syndicate discipline allowed Las Vegas to flourish without significant interference. The syndicate's control extended beyond casinos. Developers, contractors, and local politicians became complicit, knowingly or otherwise, in the expansion of mob-backed properties. These relationships ensured that construction contracts, building permits, and zoning approvals favored those aligned with the mafia. With each successful project, the mob's influence grew, and the Flamingo's model was replicated in successive resorts. High rollers, attracted by the combination of luxury and discretion, helped solidify the city's status as a premier gambling destination, while syndicate profits were funneled into both local investments and national criminal enterprises. Despite these gains, law enforcement began to take notice. The Kefauver Committee, formed in 1950 under the U.S. Senate, launched hearings that brought organized crime into the national spotlight. Testimonies from mob associates, informants, and witnesses painted a picture of a sprawling criminal network that stretched from the East Coast to the desert casinos of Nevada. Virginia Hill's earlier testimony provided investigators with critical insights into syndicate finances, though her evasive answers left many questions unresolved. For the first time, the public learned how intricately connected the mob's operations were, and Las Vegas emerged as a key node in this network. The hearings were sensationalized by the media, bringing fame and notoriety to figures previously known only within criminal circles. While Siegel was dead, his legacy lingered. The public and press often romanticized him as the gangster who had built Las Vegas, overlooking the financial mismanagement and reckless behavior that had contributed to his assassination. In reality, the city's transformation was the result of methodical planning and disciplined execution by Sedway, Greenbaum, and other syndicate operatives. Yet the allure of Siegel's name persisted, and for many, he became a symbol of both the glamour and danger inherent in organized crime. In this environment, Las Vegas evolved into a city where the lines between legality and criminality were blurred. Casino owners, hotel managers, and entertainers interacted daily with individuals tied to the mafia, yet the city's entertainment veneer shielded these connections from public scrutiny. The combination of opulence, discretion, and effective management allowed the syndicate to operate openly while avoiding prosecution. The Flamingo became a case study in this balance, demonstrating that with careful control and strategic alliances, organized crime could thrive in plain sight. By the mid-1950s, syndicate-backed casinos were generating substantial revenue, which was distributed to mob leaders across the country. Skimming, the diversion of unreported cash from casino operations, became a standard practice. Las Vegas provided an ideal environment for this: high volumes of cash, limited regulatory oversight, and a network of trusted operatives capable of discreetly moving funds. Through these mechanisms, the syndicate financed operations in other cities, invested in legitimate businesses, and maintained influence over politicians and law enforcement. The city became both a profit center and a testing ground for modern organized crime strategies. The success of these operations also reinforced the mafia's internal hierarchy. The lesson from Bugsy Siegel's assassination remained clear: the organization valued order, discipline, and accountability above all. Ambition and creativity were tolerated, but recklessness or mismanagement were not. Figures like Sedway and Greenbaum, who prioritized operational control and reliable revenue streams, exemplified the model the syndicate preferred. The stability of Las Vegas under their leadership contrasted sharply with Siegel's chaotic tenure, highlighting the shift from flamboyant entrepreneurship to disciplined management within organized crime. Entertainment in Las Vegas became an integral part of the mob's strategy. Nightclubs, live shows, and luxury hotels attracted visitors while concealing the syndicate's financial activities. Performers, unaware or unconcerned about the casino's ownership, lent credibility to the city's image of glamour and sophistication. The mob recognized that perception was as important as revenue. By creating an environment that appeared legitimate and aspirational, they could ensure continued patronage and minimize scrutiny. The Flamingo's entertainment model was replicated in subsequent resorts, reinforcing Las Vegas' emerging identity as an entertainment capital. Throughout this period, the syndicate remained vigilant about security and risk management. Law enforcement inquiries, internal audits, and rival threats were taken seriously. Any potential exposure or inefficiency was addressed swiftly, with systems in place to prevent leaks or mismanagement. This discipline extended to personnel. Trusted associates were promoted, while those who failed to meet expectations faced reassignment or exclusion. Las Vegas' transformation was thus not accidental. It was the product of calculated, strategic oversight that balanced ambition with caution. By the late 1950s, Las Vegas was no longer a fringe gambling town. It was a national phenomenon. Syndicate-backed resorts dominated the Strip, attracting tourists from across the country. The Flamingo stood as a monument to Siegel's vision and his tragic failure, a reminder that the realization of a dream often depended on discipline and strategic execution rather than sheer charisma. Syndicate leaders continued to expand their interests, building a network of casinos that would sustain organized crime for decades. The lessons learned from Siegel's tenure, both his successes and failures, were applied rigorously, ensuring that the mob maintained control while minimizing risk. In retrospect, Siegel's influence on Las Vegas cannot be overstated. He identified the city's potential at a time when few others could see it, envisioning a destination that combined gambling, entertainment, and luxury. Though his mismanagement led to his death, the foundation he laid enabled the syndicate to create a thriving, profitable network of casinos. His name remained synonymous with both the glamour and danger of early Las Vegas, immortalized in the media and popular culture. Yet the operational realities behind the neon lights reflected careful planning, discipline, and the unyielding priorities of organized crime. As Las Vegas entered the 1960s, it became a microcosm of organized crime's evolution in America. The city exemplified how syndicates could adapt to modern business practices, leveraging legality and perception to maximize profits while maintaining control. Siegel's death had been the turning point. It demonstrated the cost of recklessness, reinforced the primacy of organizational oversight, and set the stage for decades of syndicate dominance in Las Vegas. The Flamingo and other casinos became enduring symbols of this new era, blending ambition, entertainment, and criminal enterprise in a way that had never been seen before. By the early 1960s, Las Vegas had fully emerged as a national entertainment and gambling destination. The city's transformation from a modest desert outpost to a glittering oasis of casinos, hotels, and nightlife was inextricably linked to the groundwork laid by Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Though Siegel himself had been dead for over a decade, his vision of a luxurious, high-stakes gaming environment had become reality under the careful oversight of syndicate managers. Mo Sedway, Gus Greenbaum, and other mob affiliates continued to expand operations, solidifying Las Vegas as a cash-generating engine for organized crime. The Flamingo remained a symbol of both ambition and caution. While Siegel's name continued to attract fascination, the operational model established after his death was far more disciplined. Syndicate leaders had learned that controlling revenue streams and personnel was more important than flamboyant showmanship. Frontmen managed day-to-day operations, ensuring compliance with regulations and minimizing scrutiny, while high rollers were cultivated through targeted incentives and discreet entertainment. In essence, Las Vegas had become a city built on illusion, where glitz and glamour masked the disciplined mechanics of the mob. The expansion of the Strip accelerated during this period. New casinos, hotels, and entertainment complexes emerged, many financed or controlled by the same syndicate figures who had salvaged the Flamingo. Syndicate leaders understood that scale was critical. A network of interconnected operations allowed for both risk management and maximum profitability. Cash from one property could support another, and personnel could be rotated across venues to prevent exposure. Las Vegas, in this sense, became a living laboratory for organized crime, a city designed to generate revenue efficiently while remaining largely untouchable by law enforcement. Federal authorities, however, were beginning to recognize the national scope of syndicate operations. The Kefauver Committee hearings of the early 1950s had exposed organized crime's influence, and subsequent investigations in the late 1950s and early 1960s began to focus more intensely on Las Vegas. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, slowly increased surveillance, recognizing that the city was a key node in the syndicate's national network. Wiretaps, informants, and financial audits were employed to track the flow of funds and to identify key players, though prosecution remained challenging. Syndicate members were careful to insulate themselves through layers of front men and shell corporations, making legal accountability difficult. Entertainment continued to be an integral part of Las Vegas' identity. Shows featuring major stars, lavish hotel amenities, and themed attractions drew visitors from across the country. While Siegel had envisioned celebrity appeal as a cornerstone of the Flamingo, the syndicate refined this concept, prioritizing operational efficiency and discreet financial management. Talent contracts, event schedules, and hotel services were meticulously coordinated to enhance the city's image while ensuring profitability. The Flamingo and subsequent resorts became destinations not only for gambling but for an entire entertainment experience, blending luxury with a carefully controlled environment. By the mid-1960s, Las Vegas had become the prototype for mob-run casino operations. Syndicate leaders in Chicago, New York, and Cleveland used the city as a hub for both revenue generation and money laundering. Funds from the casinos were routed through complex networks of shell companies, offshore accounts, and legitimate businesses, obscuring their origins and reducing exposure to federal authorities. This financial sophistication was one of Siegel's lasting legacies. His initial vision had forced the syndicate to adapt modern business strategies to organized crime, a model that would persist for decades. The stability of Las Vegas operations reinforced the syndicate's power in other areas. With consistent cash flow from the casinos, leaders could finance narcotics, extortion, and loan sharking operations in other cities. They could influence politicians, law enforcement officials, and local businesses, creating an ecosystem in which the syndicate's influence extended far beyond Nevada. Las Vegas, therefore, was both a revenue source and a strategic asset, illustrating how organized crime could blend legitimate enterprise with illicit oversight. While Siegel had been a visionary, his death underscored the importance of discipline. His extravagant spending, impulsive decisions, and lack of operational control had ultimately led to his assassination in 1947. Sedway and Greenbaum's methodical management, by contrast, demonstrated that the mob could succeed by minimizing risk and focusing on sustainable profit. The lessons learned from Siegel's tenure shaped the syndicate's approach to organized crime. Vision was valuable, but only when tempered by structure, oversight, and accountability. Public perception of Siegel evolved over the years. Hollywood continued to romanticize him as the glamorous gangster who had built Las Vegas, even as those within the syndicate privately regarded him as reckless and impetuous. In newspapers, magazines, and later in films, Siegel's story became emblematic of the American gangster mythos, daring, ambitious, and ultimately tragic. Yet beneath the legend was a stark reality. The city he had dreamed of could only succeed under the calculated hands of men who understood the mechanics of organized crime. Las Vegas also demonstrated the broader societal impact of organized crime. The city's growth provided jobs, infrastructure, and entertainment, but it was built on illicit foundations. Local governments benefited from tax revenues and tourism, often overlooking the syndicate's control and corruption. This duality, public prosperity emerging from private criminal enterprise, was central to the city's identity and would define its trajectory for decades. The Flamingo, in particular, symbolized this balance, luxury and spectacle masking an intricate criminal operation. By the late 1960s, Las Vegas had cemented its status as a major American city. The Strip was lined with casinos, many under mob influence, attracting millions of visitors annually. Syndicate profits funded operations nationwide, while the city itself became a model for the integration of organized crime and legitimate business. Bugsy Siegel's role, though brief, remained foundational. He had envisioned the potential, endured failure, and paid with his life, setting the stage for a system that could thrive without him. The lessons of Siegel's life continued to inform organized crime practices. Ambition and vision were prized, but success required meticulous planning, accountability, and operational control. The mob's ability to sustain Las Vegas for decades relied on this balance between creativity and discipline. Casinos became both entertainment destinations and financial instruments, demonstrating that organized crime could adapt to modern capitalism in ways previously unimaginable. Siegel's legacy, therefore, was paradoxical. He was simultaneously the originator of a transformative idea and a cautionary tale about the perils of unchecked ambition. As Las Vegas matured in the 1970s and beyond, the city's identity as a gambling and entertainment capital became inseparable from its roots in organized crime. Syndicate-backed casinos continued to thrive, attracting tourists, celebrities, and investors while maintaining the mechanisms of control established in the post-Siegel era. Federal scrutiny intensified, but the lessons learned from early operations, including the importance of discretion, front men, and layered financial networks, allowed the mob to operate with a surprising degree of immunity. Ultimately, Bugsy Siegel's impact on Las Vegas was enduring. His death may have been the end of his personal ambitions, but it catalyzed a system of organized crime management that transformed the city forever. From the Flamingo to the sprawling resorts that followed, Siegel's vision shaped the physical, economic, and cultural landscape of Las Vegas. The city became a symbol of ambition, risk, and the complex interplay between legality and organized crime, a legacy that continues to define its identity today.